There's a place on this earth where the sand swallows secrets, where the wind erases footprints that are 4,000 years old. Nobody told you this was coming. That is the first thing you need to understand. The discovery was not announced with fanfare. It was not broadcast across every major news network. It did not trend globally for days. Instead, it arrived quietly, the way the most dangerous truths always do, buried inside academic journals and geological reports written in the dry language of science. Carefully measured, carefully worded, carefully presented so as not to cause panic. But when you strip away the careful language, when you remove the qualifications and the footnotes and the peer review formalities, what remains is a single staggering reality. The desert that has terrorized human civilization for thousands of years has been hiding something underneath it, something that rewrites the story of where we came from, what we knew, and what we have been wrong about for centuries. Let's begin with what you already think you know, because that is where the deception lives. The Taklamakan Desert sits in the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, cradled between some of the most formidable mountain ranges on the planet. To the north, the Tian Shan, the so-called Mountains of Heaven, rise like sentinels. To the south, the Kunlun Mountains create an almost impenetrable wall. To the west, the Pamirs close in. The desert itself is not merely large. It is the second largest shifting sand desert on Earth, covering an area roughly the size of Germany, and 85% of it is composed of moving dunes, dunes that do not stay still, dunes that swallow roads and railways and villages and anything else that dares to plant itself in their path. The average annual rainfall inside the desert's core does not exceed 10 millimeters. In some zones, it drops to 4 or 5 millimeters, not per month, per year. By comparison, the Sahara, which most people consider the gold standard of inhospitable landscapes, receives vastly more water than this. The Taklamakan is, by almost every measurable standard, the closest thing to a dead zone that exists at the surface of our planet. And here is where it gets strange, because for thousands of years, this is what the world believed. The Taklamakan was always a desert. It was always this way. Nothing lived here, nothing could live here, nothing that mattered happened here. It was a void, a geological footnote, a place you went around, never through. Ancient Silk Road traders would skirt its edges with deliberate terror, clinging to oasis towns like Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Hotan, never venturing into the interior, never daring to see what lived in the silence beyond the dunes. The name itself was a warning. Taklamakan in the old Uyghur tongue means, you go in, you don't come out. That name was not metaphor. That name was instruction. So when scientists began uncovering what was actually buried beneath that sand, the implications were not merely archaeological. They were civilizational. They were geological. They were, in the most fundamental sense, a challenge to the accepted architecture of human history. Think about what that means. Not a small correction, not a minor adjustment to the timeline. A structural challenge, a foundation-level problem with the story we have been telling ourselves about this part of the world for generations. The first layer of the discovery was about water, and nothing prepares you for what that means when applied to the Taklamakan. A research team led by Professor Yang Xiaoping at Zhejiang University's School of Earth Sciences had been conducting systematic fieldwork across the central and western parts of the Taklamakan since 2015. These were not casual excursions. These were sustained, technically sophisticated expeditions involving remote sensing analysis, geomorphological mapping, quaternary geology, and a dating technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time mineral grains were exposed to sunlight and can therefore tell you precisely when layers of sediment were deposited and when they were buried. It is a technique that strips the desert of its ability to lie. And what the desert revealed, when confronted with this level of scientific scrutiny, was extraordinary. The core of the Taklamakan, the most arid, most inhospitable, most supposedly lifeless region of the entire desert, had been flooded with water. Not once, not twice. 3 separate times in its geological history, rivers and lakes had stretched across the very heart of what is now the driest place in Asia. The research team identified 3 distinct wet periods, the first stretching from approximately 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, the second during the late glacial period of the last ice age, roughly 17,000 to 11,000 years ago, and the third during a period called the late Holocene, somewhere between 4,000 and 2,000 years ago. The sedimentary evidence was unambiguous. Layers of fluvial and lacustrine deposits, the geological fingerprints of rivers and lakes, were found buried beneath the modern dunes. For the first time in the history of science, the research community had comprehensively and systematically documented the occurrence of rivers and lakes in the central Taklamakan Desert. Read that again. Rivers and lakes, in the center of the place of no return. This was not a small seasonal stream. This was not a temporary puddle left by a storm. These were sustained hydrological systems, rivers that flowed from the surrounding mountains deep into the desert interior, lakes that held water long enough to leave thick layers of identifiable sediment. The team found evidence of the Nia River, which today dies in the southern desert margins, once reaching far into the interior during these wetter periods, carrying enough water to sustain not just geography, but potentially life. Organized, sustained, culturally advanced human life. And this is where everything changes. Because buried in the same desert, scattered across hundreds of sites in the Tarim Basin that cradles the Taklamakan, archaeologists have been pulling something else out of the sand for decades. Something that should not be there. Something that the accepted version of human migration and cultural development cannot fully explain. In the late 1980s, mummies began appearing in the remote reaches of the Taklamakan. Not the mummies of ancient Egypt, carefully preserved through ritual and deliberate process. These were different. These were naturally mummified by the extreme aridity and saline soils of the desert environment, preserved not through human intervention, but through the desert's own brutal chemistry. And they were extraordinary, perfectly preserved, still possessing skin and hair and identifiable facial features, features that caused immediate and profound confusion among the archaeologists who uncovered them. These mummies looked European. Long, reddish-blonde hair, tall physical stature, facial structures associated with Western Eurasian populations, wool clothing of extraordinary sophistication, tartans and plaids, whose weaving techniques bore striking resemblance to Bronze Age textile traditions from thousands of miles away in Europe and the Near East. Some individuals were buried in wooden boats, an extraordinary choice given that they were interred in a desert where the nearest navigable water was impossibly far away, suggesting that these people carried a cultural memory of water so deep that even in death they wanted to be sailing. The burial sites, numbering in the hundreds and dating as far back as 3 to 1800 years, spread across the southern and eastern edges of the Taklamakan, precisely where the ancient evidence of rivers and lakes had now been scientifically confirmed. But here is where it gets worse. For decades, the leading hypotheses about who these people were revolved around migration. The logical assumption was that these Bronze Age individuals with Western features had migrated into the Tarim Basin from somewhere else. Two main theories competed. The first held that they were Proto-Tocharian-speaking pastoralists descended from the Afanassievo culture of the Eurasian steppes. The second proposed that they had originated among the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a sophisticated urban civilization that flourished in what is today Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Both theories made geographical and cultural sense. Both had supporting evidence. Both gave historians a comfortable migration story that fit inside the existing framework of how human populations moved and spread across Eurasia during the Bronze Age. Both were wrong. In 2021, a landmark genomic study published in the journal Nature, one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed publications in the world, subjected the ancient DNA of the earliest Tarim Basin mummies to the most sophisticated genetic analysis ever applied to this population. The results were published by a research team drawing on expertise from institutions across multiple continents. And what those results showed demolished both prevailing theories simultaneously. The DNA of the earliest mummies, the individuals buried in the Tarim Basin as long as 4,000 years ago, did not match the Afanassievo culture. It did not match the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. It did not match any known migrating population from the surrounding regions. Instead, the genetic profile of these people indicated that they were a genetically isolated local population, a group that had been living in the Tarim Basin for a very long time, that had not recently arrived from anywhere, and that was genetically distinct from virtually every other population on Earth at that time. According to informed sources in the academic community, this finding created something close to a quiet crisis in the field of ancient DNA research. Because if these people did not migrate from the steppes, and they did not migrate from Central Asian urban centers, and they were genetically isolated from the populations around them, then the question that follows is both simple and terrifying. Where did they come from, and how long had they been there? What most people are not seeing is the implication of combining these two discoveries. Think about it carefully. On one hand, you have geological evidence that the core of the Taklamakan Desert was flooded with rivers and lakes during multiple periods, the most recent ending somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. On the other hand, you have genetic evidence of a population that was genetically isolated, meaning they were not newcomers, meaning their ancestors had been in that basin for long enough to develop a distinctly unique genetic signature, one that diverges from all neighboring populations in a way that requires sustained separation, sustained enough to cause measurable genetic drift. You do not develop that kind of genetic isolation in a generation. You do not develop it in a century. You develop it over thousands of years of living apart from everyone else. And the only place in the Tarim Basin where you could live apart from everyone else, the only place where the surrounding mountain ranges and desert conditions would create a natural laboratory of isolation, is the very place that science has now confirmed was not always a desert. This is not chaos, this is a convergence. And it points toward a civilization that existed in a place we were told could not support civilization. The mummies themselves carried other clues that the standard historical framework struggled to absorb. Their textiles were not primitive. Researchers who analyzed the wool fabrics found with the Tarim mummies discovered weaving techniques of considerable sophistication, diagonal twill patterns, color combinations, and structural complexity that had clear parallels with textile traditions in the ancient Near East and even Bronze Age Europe, despite the fact that the Tarim Basin was supposedly an isolated region with minimal outside contact. Elizabeth Wayland Barber, one of the foremost authorities on ancient textiles, devoted significant scholarly work to these fabrics and their implications. The clothing was not the dress of wandering nomads, scraping an existence from a hostile landscape. It was the clothing of people who had mastered their craft, people who had time, stability, resources, and social organization sufficient to develop and transmit complex textile traditions across generations. And then there was the food. In 2022, researchers announced the discovery of the world's oldest cheese found attached to the necks and bodies of the Tarim mummies. The cheese, made from a combination of cow's milk and kefir, had survived nearly 3,500 years in the desert's preserving embrace. What made this discovery significant was not merely its age, though that alone was extraordinary enough to reshape the history of dairy production. What made it significant was what it revealed about the social and economic complexity of the people who made it. Cheese is not a food of desperation. Cheese is not something you produce when you're simply trying to survive from day to day in a hostile environment. Cheese is a food of surplus, a product that requires agricultural organization, animal husbandry, controlled fermentation processes, and enough stability and food security to invest time in producing something that will be consumed in the future, rather than immediately. The presence of sophisticated cheese among the earliest mummies of the Tarim Basin indicated that these people were not struggling to survive. They were thriving. They had developed a functioning agricultural economy in a place that, according to everything we knew about this region, should have been unable to support one. But here is the deeper problem, the one that the mainstream conversation keeps sidestepping. If the rivers and lakes of the Taklamakan's core were only beginning to dry out between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago, and if a genetically isolated, culturally sophisticated population was living in the Tarim Basin during this same period, then what happened before that? If we know there was a wet period from 17,000 to 11,000 years ago, a period when rivers reached the interior and lakes held water across what is now empty sand, what lived there during that time? We have genomic evidence of isolation. We have geological evidence of habitability. We have archaeological evidence of cultural sophistication that seems to predate contact with the surrounding world. But the dunes of the Taklamakan have moved. They have shifted and reshaped and buried the landscape thousands of times over thousands of years. More than 85% of the desert's surface is composed of these mobile dunes. What lies beneath the sections that have not yet been excavated is genuinely unknown. And the scale of what might be down there is something that the scientific community is beginning very carefully to acknowledge. Then came the water discovery, not the ancient rivers. Something else, something beneath the sand itself that scientists stumbled upon by accident while studying an entirely different problem. A research team from the Chinese Academy of Sciences Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography was conducting a study on carbon dioxide absorption in the Tarim Basin. They were not looking for water. They were looking for carbon, tracking the movement of greenhouse gases through the desert's atmosphere and soil. But as they collected nearly 200 deep underground water samples from locations across the desert, something in the data did not make sense. Large quantities of carbon dioxide were disappearing and being absorbed at rates that did not match the surface environment. The most scientifically defensible explanation, which they subsequently published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, was that the carbon dioxide was being dissolved into a massive reservoir of underground water. Water that had been accumulating beneath the desert basin over the course of centuries, fed by glacial melt from the surrounding mountain ranges, trickling down through the porous desert substrate. The estimates of how much water existed in this underground system were so staggering that Professor Li Yan, who led the study, told the South China Morning Post, "Never before have people dared to imagine so much water under the sand. Our definition of desert may have to change. The volume of water estimated to be in this underground system could amount to 10 times the water held in all 5 of the North American Great Lakes combined. Think about what that means for a moment. 10 times the Great Lakes underneath the desert. Now, the scientific community has appropriately noted the uncertainties in this estimate. Some geologists have pushed back on the methodology, suggesting the figures may be optimistic. The water, as it turned out, was not fresh water. It was highly saline and carbonated, essentially a massive underground reservoir of salt water infused with CO2, which one researcher memorably described as like a can of Coke, explaining that if it were opened suddenly, the greenhouse gas content would escape catastrophically into the atmosphere. So it was not a hidden resource waiting to be tapped. It was not a solution to regional water scarcity, but that was never the point. The point was what it revealed about the physical history of this landscape. Water that accumulates underground over centuries in a desert does not appear from nowhere. It is the residue of something that was, for a very long time, considerably wetter on the surface. The underground ocean was not merely a strange anomaly. It was a geological memory, a record written in water rather than stone, of a landscape that once supported something very different from the dead expanse we look at today. And now, in a development that has astonished the scientific community in ways that loop back to everything we have been discussing, China has done something to this desert that was previously considered physically impossible. In November of 2024, workers on the southern rim of the Taklamakan pressed the last seedlings into the sand and completed what may be the single most ambitious ecological engineering project in human history. A green belt, an unbroken living barrier of trees and shrubs, 3,046 kilometers long, encircling the entire perimeter of the Taklamakan Desert. The project, which began in 1978 under China's 3 North Shelter Belt program, originally had a purely defensive purpose. The goal was to slow the movement of sand dunes that were encroaching on highways, railways, farmland, and settlements along the desert's edges. For generations, communities on the Taklamakan's margins had watched sandstorms bury their crops, swallow their roads, and threaten their lives. The Greenbelt was a response born of desperation and engineering ambition. 46 years to complete, 3,046 kilometers of living wall. And what scientists found when they measured the results was something nobody had fully predicted, something that seems, in retrospect, almost impossible. The desert was absorbing carbon, more carbon than it was releasing. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences confirmed what the researchers were calling the first quantitative evidence that large-scale planting could transform arid desert margins into net carbon absorbers. The Taklamakan, the biological void, the place of no return, was now measurably a carbon sink. But the implications did not stop at climate science. A 2025 study published in the journal Earth's Future, tracking vegetation changes across the region between 2001 and 2020, had found that the scale of the reforestation was actively altering weather patterns across China's interior. The trees were changing rainfall distribution. They were influencing atmospheric moisture. They were, in a quantifiable way, beginning to modify the climate of the surrounding region. Scientists from Tianjin University, China Agricultural University, and Utrecht University documented these effects and noted that the water cycle of northwestern China was being measurably reshaped by the presence of this ring of vegetation. Here is where it gets truly remarkable. The trees that China planted to protect the desert's edges from encroachment were, inadvertently, beginning to recreate some of the conditions that geological evidence suggests once made the interior of that desert habitable. The moisture patterns are shifting, the carbon dynamics are changing, the sand is being stabilized, and beneath all of it, the underground water reservoir persists, vast and strange and scientifically documented, a remnant of wetter eras, sitting beneath the feet of a landscape that is slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something different from what it has been for the past several thousand years. What most people are not seeing is the full circle of what this means. The Taklamakan Desert has not always been a desert. The people who lived in its basin were not migrants from elsewhere, but a genetically isolated population whose ancestors survived through multiple cycles of wet and dry. They were sophisticated enough to produce cheese and complex textiles and to bury their dead in boats in the middle of a desert because they remembered water. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, water is coming back to that landscape. Not from rain, not from rivers, but from a deliberate act of ecological engineering that was never intended to do what it is actually doing. The real story is not about a desert being reclaimed. The real story is about a civilization that existed in that desert before the sand swallowed it, before the dunes erased the evidence, before history decided this region was always empty and always inhospitable and always silent. The real story is about what the sand has been hiding for 4,000 years, and about the growing possibility that beneath the still unexplored depths of the Taklamakan, beneath the 85% of shifting dunes that have never been properly excavated, beneath the underground ocean that scientists stumbled upon while looking for something else entirely, there are answers to questions we have not yet thought to ask. Consider the mathematics of it. The Tarim Basin covers an area of over 1 million square kilometers. The mummies and archaeological sites discovered so far represent a fraction of the total area. Excavation in the Taklamakan is logistically brutal. The heat reaches 40 degrees Celsius in summer. The cold crashes to minus 20 in winter. The sand moves continuously. A site that is visible in one season can be buried beyond reach in the next. The conditions that made the desert perfect for preserving the mummies, the extreme aridity, the salt-rich soil, the cold winters that arrested decomposition, are the same conditions that make systematic archaeological survey nearly impossible. We have, essentially, been looking at the edge of something enormous while remaining largely unable to see its center. And now, with satellite remote sensing technology advancing at extraordinary speed, with synthetic aperture radar capable of penetrating sand layers and identifying subsurface structures, with the kind of systematic geological mapping that Professor Yang Xiaoping's team pioneered, the center is beginning to come into view. What it is showing is not a wasteland. What it is showing is a landscape with a hidden architecture, buried riverbeds, ancient lakeshores, sediment sequences that tell stories of human presence in places previously declared uninhabitable, and a genetic record of a people so isolated, so self-contained, so culturally developed that the only explanation science can currently offer is that they were there for a very long time, in a place that was, for much of that time, considerably more alive than anything visible today. According to informed sources in the geological and anthropological communities, what we are building toward is not a single dramatic discovery. It is a slow-motion revelation, the kind that does not arrive in a press conference or a viral announcement, but in the accumulation of data points that, when assembled together, form a picture nobody was expecting to see. The underground water, the ancient river systems, the genetically isolated mummies, the sophisticated textiles, the Bronze Age cheese, the green belt that is changing the weather. Each one, taken alone, is a fascinating scientific finding. Taken together, they are something else. They are a case that the history of human civilization in Central Asia is far older, far more complex, far more deeply rooted in this specific landscape than the standard academic narrative has been willing to accommodate. And here is where the uncertainty becomes its own kind of evidence. China has, for decades, maintained careful control over archaeological access to Xinjiang. The Tarim mummies and their implications for pre-Han Chinese population history touch on politically sensitive questions about the ethnic and cultural origins of the Xinjiang region, questions that intersect in uncomfortable ways with the current geopolitical situation involving the Uyghur population. Access to excavation sites, publication of findings, and the international scientific collaboration required to properly investigate this region have all been complicated by factors that have nothing to do with geology or archaeology and everything to do with political sensitivity. What this means practically is that the scientific picture we currently have of the Taklamakan's buried history is almost certainly incomplete, not because the evidence does not exist, but because the territory in which that evidence lies is not fully accessible to the global scientific community. The Greenbelt, ironically, may change this. As China's ecological engineering transforms the desert's margins, as the water dynamics of the region shift, as previously buried sites emerge from the sand or previously stable sites become newly exposed, the landscape itself is forcing the issue. Nature does not respect political geography. The dunes move according to physics, not policy. And as the dunes move, they reveal. What is coming out of that desert over the next decade may be the most significant archaeological revelation of the 21st century. The infrastructure of investigation is slowly being built. The satellite data is accumulating, the genomic databases are expanding, the geological framework is being refined. And somewhere beneath 340,000 square kilometers of sand, beneath an underground ocean that should not exist, beneath dunes that have been moving and shifting and burying secrets for 4,000 years, there are answers, there are structures, there are remains. There are the traces of a people whose story has been waiting in remarkable preservation for someone to finally look in the right place. The desert is not empty. It never was. And the evidence suggests that what it has been hiding is far older, far stranger, and far more consequential to our understanding of human civilization than anything we have allowed ourselves to imagine. The question is not whether the Taklamakan is hiding something. We have already confirmed that it is. The question, the one that will define the next chapter of the story, is how much has survived the sand, and what will happen to the version of history we have been teaching when we finally find it. Because if what has already emerged from the desert, through the work of geneticists and geologists and archaeologists and remote sensing specialists and ecological engineers who were just trying to plant some trees, if all of that already demands a fundamental rewrite of what we thought we knew, then what is still buried beneath the dunes is either the final confirmation of something extraordinary or the beginning of a question so large that our current framework of human history may not be built to contain the answer. The sand is still moving. The desert is still breathing. And somewhere in the silence beneath the dunes, something is waiting to be found that doesn't belong in any version of the story we have been told. Something that was never supposed to survive, and yet somehow did.